Hi, this is Eric Keller for Otoy. In this video, we're going to take a look at working with VDB sequences in Octane for Cinema4D. So this is a sequence that I rendered out of Cinema4D using Octane, and as you can tell, it's an animated VDB sequence. The sequence itself was created in Houdini. It's actually pretty easy to do, to create a very basic explosion like this. But let's start with Cinema4D and how to render it, and then after that we'll take a quick look at how this was generated in Houdini. Okay, so we're in Cinema4D. Let's go to the Octane. Let's go to the Octane menu, open up the live viewer, and I'm going to choose Object, Octane VDB Volume. Now in this scene already, I have a plane and a daylight setting. So if I do a render, we'll just see our daylight lighting and the plane right here. It's very dark, but it's definitely there. Don't see anything for the VDB volume yet. So if you haven't watched the first video in this two-part series, please watch that, because that goes over the basics of working with VDB. In this one, we're just going to skip right to loading in a sequence. So select VDB volume. Let's go down here to main. Let's make sure that type is set to VDB loader. Let's go to VDB, click on File, and find our sequence. Mine is actually called Explosion Sequence 1. It's about 60 frames long. So you can see there's the 60 frames. I'll choose Open. It's going to load the first frame of the sequence. We're not going to see much yet because there's not much going on the first frame. So I want to set the parameters of the actual animation. Since it's 60 frames, let's start by setting the end frame to 60. And let's set the start frame to 1. Now currently the timeline is set to frame 18. So by setting this to a sequence, we're already loading in frame 18, or we should be on frame 18 of the sequence. If we zoom in, we don't see much. But after a little bit of hunting, you'll find that there is a little itty-bitty puff of cloud right there, and that is our volume. So let's make that bigger. Let's zoom out. I'm going to go to the coordinate section, and let's set the scale to each of these to about 100 by 100 by 100. Ideally, when you create the sequence, if you're in Houdini or whatever, you want to make it in real-world units so that it does behave physically accurately. But this is just a quick demo, so I'm kind of cheating by scaling it up. But here we can see in the middle of our sequence, we've got this little dark cloud. If I set this to another frame, skip ahead to say frame 24, and give it a few seconds to update, we'll see that now we have a different frame in the sequence and the cloud is a little bit higher in the sky. So now that we have it loaded and the sequence is operating, it's time to actually play with the medium settings so we can see how this should be shaded. So I'm going to go to the VDB tab and take a look at the grid mapping. So we have absorption mapping and scatter mapping both set to density, and emission mapping set to temperature. Let's see what happens when I set this to heat. These options are written out when the VDB sequence was created from Houdini. So when I actually exported from Houdini, I made sure that it had density, heat, fuel, heat, temperature. You could also include velocity, which again you could connect velocity to these velocity X mapping, Y mapping, and Z mapping, and then enable motion blur so that you can get some motion blurring in there. But in this case, I just kept it simple, and I just kept it to these 4 options. So let's now go over to medium, and I'm going to click on the volume medium button here to take a look at our shading. As I mentioned in the previous video, you can change the density by lowering the density slider or increasing it. Sometimes when you load a VDB and it's really hard to see, you might actually need to play with the density and the volume step length sliders until it actually becomes visible. And some of the presets that I've downloaded before, I've noticed I've loaded them in there and they're practically invisible. We just see a very faint wisp, and then when you start playing with density and volume step length, it becomes immediately apparent in the render. So don't assume that it's not working. First, check these sliders and make sure that they're set properly. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the medium tab, and just to speed things along, I'm going to click on the fire button, which loads a preset, a shading preset, which automatically now gives incandescence to the object. So let's go back to the volume medium, and we can go down to the volume gradient for the emission ramp and play with this a little bit to kind of adjust the colors that we see on the actual object. So with the gradient ramp here, I'm going to maybe scooch over this red marker a little bit, click to add a new marker, and let's set this one to a very dark purplish kind of color. I might not see a whole lot of change just yet, maybe a little bit, but we can start to play with where these are on the slider, and we can also play with the max volume slider. So if I start to lower the max volume, we're going to see more of the brighter colors mapped to the emission, and if I raise it, we go in the opposite direction. The default setting was about 35, I believe, so maybe let's increase this to say 60, and maybe play with these a little bit just to get a wider range of colors. And so if you're playing with this and you're not seeing much of a change, let's set this maybe down to 20 again, a little bit lower. Another thing you can do, so now we're getting a little bit more detail in there. Let's go back to the medium and back to VDB, and down here under grid mapping next to emission mapping, you can try setting this to temperature. Give it a few seconds to update. You can see that makes a huge difference. You can also set it to density and fuel. I think in this case we want that brightness to be associated most closely with the heat that's being given off by the explosion. So I'll set that back to heat. You can also play with the scale a little bit. So if I set this down to 0.25, that's going to scale the heat output, and so we're going to see it's a little bit dimmer now, not quite as bright. So you can kind of go back and forth between the grid mapping and the medium, and down here with the volume gradient, and see how this affects the look of the VDB. So you can see now we're getting a lot too much dark purple in there, and we need to get some of these lighter values. So maybe we'll play with this a little bit. Until we get something like that. And maybe bring in some of that yellow down just a little bit more. In addition to adjusting the absorption and the scattering and the emission ramp, you can also see how the explosion looks differently if you're rendering with different kernels. Right now this is set to direct light, but we can also turn this to path trace or PMC. If I go down to the emission section here and click on texture emission, I have some familiar emission properties including power. So if I want to decrease the brightness of that emission output, I can lower this or raise it as needed. And we have some of the other familiar emission settings. The power one is going to have the most significant difference when working with VDBs that are emitting light. One of the easiest ways to make a VDB, whether it's a single volume or a sequence, an animated sequence of VDBs, is to use Houdini. So let's jump over to Houdini Apprentice and see what's involved in making a sequence like this one. So I'm in the Houdini Apprentice edition, and I'm going to create a quick explosion effect that we can export as a VDB sequence. So I'll click on Sphere. So I'll click on that, and with that selected, I'm going to go to the Pyro tab of the shelf here, and let's click on Fireball, and then click on the sphere, and you should see it turn into kind of a little puff there. And if I press the play button, it will start to calculate the sequence, and you can see that we're getting this kind of effect right here. So obviously you can spend some time tuning the effect however you like. If you want to add a little bit more detail in here, because this is kind of a blocky, if you select the Pyro node and go to the division size, and if you lower this, right now this is set to 0.0875, but if I make that smaller, it's going to make the voxel size smaller, and then so we'll end up with a more detail. It'll also take longer to calculate, and the exported files will be larger, but that's the easiest and fastest way to add a little bit more detail to the simulation. So let's go up a level want to find the Pyro import node. Let's double click on it to jump inside. And there are two nodes within here. There's the import Pyro visualization. You can put that off to the side for the moment. We want to take a look at the import Pyro fields node. And I'm going to press the tab button to pull up the tab menu and type in convert and choose convert VDB. Place this right here. And let's click on this part of the node and drag a wire to the import Pyro field, so those are now connected. And with the convert VDB node selected, I need to tell it exactly what to convert it to. I want it to convert it to a VDB file. And under group, I'm going to specify what I want to export. So if I click on this arrow right here, it gives me the choices, which are density, fuel, heat, temperature, which we showed in the Cinema4D file, and we also have velocity, x, y, and z. So just to keep things nice and quick, I'm going to choose density, and we'll do, let's do heat as well. So now that we have that selected, well, all we need to do is add a write node so that we can write this to disk. Press the tab button and type file to bring up a file node. Connect this to the file node, like so, and I want to write files, and then I want to choose a location for my file. Let's put it in one of our previous folders right here, and I'm going to call this one new explosion dot $, F for frame sequence dot VDB. Let's set our timeline to something nice and short. Let's just do 15 frames. And then with the file node selected, I'm going to rewind. Let's go to the beginning of the sequence and press the play button to play through it. Now if I go over to the file browser, you can see that it has written out the new explosion 15 frames right here to disk, and that is what I can import into Cinema4D. So that covers the basics of working with VDB files in Octane for Cinema4D with a little bit of Houdini thrown in there for good measure.